Our panel here of experts is going to have a tough act to follow here, having just following the undersecretary. You have their bios. What we're going to do here is have each person give a very brief, 4 or 5 minute presentation, so that that they are able to make sure that they get across whatever incredibly interesting and new and innovative points that they want to make sure that they have that you all know about. And then we're going to have a dialogue. We're also going to be going to questions from the audience, so please feel free to start formulating your questions as you hear the presentations. Raul, can you start, since you're closest to me, and talk to us a little bit about your perspective on these issues, particularly coming from your academic background and the like?
Yeah, well, I think that, just building upon some of the messages that were relayed before, I think that Latin America particularly is in a very interesting position vis-a-vis digital development, digital economy. You got to start by putting some figures on the table. Over 63% of Latin Americans already access the internet regularly. There's a quite big development of infrastructure. And what effectively you have is there are some countries in Latin America whose development of infrastructure is converging with that of the OECD countries. Obviously the usual suspects like Argentina, Colombia, Panama, Costa Rica, Chile, obviously, Uruguay. And then obviously you have some countries that are hampered by their whole economic situation, distribution of income. But nevertheless, you have somewhat of a convergence of Latin America with the OECD countries when it comes to connectivity. Now, what are the challenges? When we look at this, we see two kinds of challenges. One of them is human capital. Clearly, today, while Latin America is graduating roughly 150,000 engineers a year, taking engineer as a proxy of the human capital need for the digital economy, that's not enough. We have a gap of roughly 60,000 engineers. Think about China is graduating 500,000. Think about that number. So we got a problem there. How are we going to fill out the necessary human capital to feed the development of applications or services and content, despite the fact that entrepreneurship is quite intense, but we have still a gap. And the other one is investment, which is kind of an interesting factor because when you look at Latin America versus the OECD countries invest 3 times per capita in telecommunications what Latin America is investing. But yet, obviously, the private sector is putting their efforts behind it. So where is the problem? And there you need a number just to understand. $69 billion is the value added of telecommunications, of the telecommunications industry in the region. Of those 69 billion, 18 billion go into taxation to producers. Taxation, permits. So, and this jives very nicely with the Undersecretary point about the Ministers of Finance. We need to recognize that if we were to lower that imposition of the producers, what is being invested today, which is roughly 29 billion a year in infrastructure, could be increased, and that's what's going to fund, the next generation of infrastructure, 5G and fiber optics and Internet of Things. That's what it's going to enable the sector to get into more of the rural areas and the like. So I would stop there because I don't want to extend myself. But
incredibly interesting 2 points on the human capital piece and on the investment piece. When you look at the investment piece and you say how much of it is being sucked out in terms of costs of administrative and tax-related costs and so forth, I imagine politically that's a hard thing to grapple. How would you recommend that countries think about this without creating the dislocations?
Yeah, we've done a lot of work about this because clearly what you see is that I recognize the difficulty in convincing a Minister of Finance to cut the budget as a result of cutting in. But the 2 factors. One, there's an asymmetry. The telecommunications sector, in relative terms, is taxed much more than other industries that could contribute for development of the region. See tourism, seeing some of the sin taxes and the like. So that's number one. So there's an asymmetry. There's a difference in sectors. And the second one that we used to convince or try to convince finance ministers is if you were to reduce those impositions the positive impact on economic growth and therefore growing the pie as a result of some of the numbers that the Undersecretary was talking about is going to be larger than the foregone taxes. Now, the problem is you cut the taxes today, the benefits you're going to see them in 4 years. And the political electoral cycle is much shorter than that. So it requires a lot of enlightenment.
All right. From the bank perspective, those are important issues for you and the like. And the Undersecretary talked about the importance of development banks and so forth. How do you see this, and how do you see this changing?
So let me maybe start from an unusual angle here. You know, a few months ago, we went to Panama to launch a report on indigenous peoples in Latin America. And as part of that, visit, I went to the Cuna de Uzdup community next to the border with Colombia. So, I mean, it's as remote as you can get from Panama City, where is the center of development. I was meeting with the leaders of the community under a palm building without cement on the floor, no? And all around us, as we were having a conversation about the importance of taking into account culture, language, the uses and customs of indigenous peoples in development, I was looking around the room, and every single person there had a cell phone, and they were taking photographs, video, tweeting, Facebooking, no? And that really gets you thinking, no? It really gets you thinking at least on three things. The first one is that digital technologies really can be drivers of development. The second one is that development efforts, every single development effort should consider the impact of digital technology. And the third one is that we should always remember that there are no silver bullets. So while I think this is an extremely important thing, we cannot go with the idea that if you build this, everything will follow and everything will fall into place. No? So maybe going deeper into these things, on digital technologies as drivers for development, it's very clear how transaction costs go down. And there are huge opportunities going forward that might change the way we learn, the way we work, the way we transact in financial markets. No? But then at the same time, digital technology is not a silver bullet. There are things that we need to do for connectivity and digital technology to fully become a driver of development, and also things that we need to do for connectivity and digital technology to thrive. No? And there is where policy dialogue and interaction comes in, where conversations at the sectoral level come in as well. No, for example, in education, there is a potential to change we learn, but it is not enough to have connectivity, hardware, and software. You also need to have the teachers that are qualified to deliver on that. And then on what we do and the angles of how we interact with the region on digital technology, and how we are incorporating digital technology and connectivity in our activities, it is broader than investments in ICT exclusively. I mean, it is part of our conversation on education. We want to improve the quality of education in Latin America, and in doing so, we need to think about the economy of the next 30 years, not the economy that we have today. We incorporated, for example, also in our dialogues on health and our investments in health. Because if you don't address the stunting problems in Guatemala, it's very hard to believe that Guatemala will be able to reap the benefits of digital technology if the people do not have the brain cell connectivity that will allow them to benefit from that. It is part of our social protection conversations. The way conditional cash transfers operate, the way resources are distributed and how they can be used can have an impact both on the development of digital technology and in helping the population reap the benefits of it. In agriculture, I just came back from Mexico. We had a conversation about warehouses, from all things. So what is the relationship between that and digital technology? Well, the project we are thinking about is one that has as much to do with building and maintaining warehouses as it does with information, with making sure that the information is available and can be used to develop all sorts of financial instruments, financial opportunities, and development opportunities. So let me maybe leave it here.
Well, thank you. But let me, if I could, just follow up on one of the things you talked about. So you talk about how transformational these things are and how incredibly important it is even to indigenous populations that are remotely so forth. How do you see the bank's role in this? One of the things the Undersecretary talked about was her concern about making sure that the banks, not just the World Bank, but all development banks, really prioritize this set of issues. How, within the bureaucracy of the bank, how is that going? How do you see this playing out?
Well, so as I was saying, no, I don't see it as a top-down imposition because that never works. I mean, the way our strategic approach to development works is it's really bottom-up. It's part of a diagnosis and a dialogue where we identify the areas where we can add most value. And in some cases that will mean, and in many, many cases that will mean, direct investments in the communication sector, no, in connectivity, in these issues. Now, it's not just that. It is making sure that this is treated as a cross-cutting issue. As I was saying, no, connectivity and digital technology should be part of our dialogue in education, should be part of our dialogue in social protection, should be part of our dialogue in taxation. Now that the region is going through a very complex period of time where budgets are being adjusted downwards, it has to be part of a conversation when we conduct public expenditure reviews and when we help countries update their fiscal regimes, no? And of course, I mean, we need to be realistic because the situation is complex now.
Always. Eric, everything's very complex.
Particularly in this part of the world.
Yes.
David, first of all, let me congratulate you. That was a terrific conversation with Kathy. It was fantastic, and I would have hoped that we would have had even more time to develop these themes, but very well done. And Carlos as well for your presentation. Thank you for bringing those issues to our attention. You said that all of us as panelists would have a very difficult time following Kathy Novelli, and that's absolutely true, but my role is actually even more complicated because I'm following two true experts on this, Raul and Jorge, who have done a magnificent job and have actually taken several of the points that I was going to make. So let me just fill in a couple, color in between the lines in a couple areas if I can. Building off primarily the report that was presented earlier and focusing specifically on a couple countries in Latin America. But the word that I really want to key on initially is opportunity. This is a huge opportunity for the Western Hemisphere, and we can look at this in a way that says, oh, look how far behind Latin America is, or we can say, look at how much opportunity there is for industry and government and the nonprofit sector to work together to promote these issues, and I think that's absolutely right. And if you look at the report, it's really interesting to see how these countries are plotted, not in absolute terms necessarily, but in relative terms. And I think this is a really important contribution to the discussion because it shows that, you know, a country doesn't have to be fully developed to be able to be, quote unquote, where they should be on some of these issues, using the resources that are available and using the initiative of their people to be able to do this. And if you look at the relative plotting of some of the countries, you can recognize that the trends for Latin America are pretty positive. Because as Latin America grows in terms of GDP, and we anticipate that this will continue, this has been a trend that has been ongoing now for some time, middle classes are growing, populations are increasing both in terms of wealth and also in terms of expectations. We can anticipate that connectivity is going to be something that will grow in these countries and frankly will become more embedded as an expectation in the populations that governments will have to deliver. So that's very positive. But we can also see that, as Jorge was saying, this isn't something that is just going to happen on its own necessarily, because we can see that there are some countries that are above where they quote unquote should be, and there are some countries that are below where they quote unquote should be. And a lot of that is represented by policies of governments. And so we need an intentional approach to this, which I think we've been hearing already about the panelists, and I won't belabor that, but I think government policies, public-private partnerships, sound regulatory structures, a vision of the future, not the past, I think these are really important. And so if you take a look at that framework, and then look at some of the countries in the Western Hemisphere, I think you get a kind of an interesting picture in terms of what's going on. The countries that score the highest on this latest iteration of the Digital Life platform in Latin America are Chile and Mexico and Colombia. And this really isn't a surprise, is it? Because these are countries that have, from government to government, taken an intentional approach to human development and also to national economic development. And they're doing relatively well. There are also 3 of the 4 countries in the Pacific Alliance. And it's not coincidental, in my view, that the Pacific Alliance, made up of countries that are forward-leaning, very, very open to global economic conditions in a positive way, are the ones that are, by and large, at the head of this. Now, there's one country in the Pacific Alliance that doesn't score particularly well, and that's a bit of an anomaly. That's Peru. I'm not exactly sure the reasons for that. I want to get a little bit more in-depth in that and talk to the folks who did the study and find out why. But again, coming back to where I began the conversation in terms of opportunity, we have a new government in Peru, which is very focused on these issues. In fact, the council just hosted him in New York last week, and we'll be hosting the finance minister of Peru this coming week here in Washington, and we'll be able to ask him specifically and directly some of these questions. But this is a country where there's real opportunity for growth in the digital space, frankly, to catch up with some of its peers in the Pacific Alliance. On the other side of the ledger, we also see 2 countries that in particular should be doing better, particularly Brazil and Argentina. And Argentina came up in a very positive way with the undersecretary, and I think she's absolutely right in terms of a country that's looking to the future. But we can also see the direct linkage of where government policies impact the application of some of these very important technologies going forward into in terms of national development. So again, there's opportunity there, but putting peers against peers, if you will put it that way, you can see where they stack up, you can see where they compare, and I think this is a tremendously important contribution to the discussion. So opportunity, intentionality, and government policies working with the private sector really do matter. So those are the points that I would make in addition to the ones that have already been made.
Terrific. Thank you, Eric, and thank you again for hosting this. This is terrific. So from you've got a unique perspective on these things from the council. Do you see the conversations shifting now amongst the countries in the Americas to focus on these issues, or is it just countries from Europe and the United States talking to countries in the Americas about these issues?
That's a really interesting question, and by and large, I would say that there is a conversation that's developing. It hasn't developed to the point where it needs to be. There are a couple things going on here. One is, as economies slow, you get to the question about how do you spend resources, and we've already talked about that and heard a little bit about that in terms of taxation, in terms of budgets, et cetera. That's a very important question, and there are some economic challenges in the region that have to be addressed. The second thing is, look, where we've seen the greatest success in Latin America in terms of economic development is when these issues have been indigenously promoted. In other words, promoted by the countries themselves and not imposed or suggested or said from the outside, this is something that needs to be done. And where that real desire for change comes from the country itself. And again, by and large, and I don't want to be overly simplistic here, but by and large, the countries where we've seen that initiative come from have been located on the Pacific coast and have been outward looking. Having said that, with new governments in Brazil and Argentina, we are seeing that conversation now beginning to develop, and we are seeing real opportunity going forward.
Let me open up for questions for everybody. I pulled some statistics this morning that I think they're not surprising numbers, but underlie some of what we're talking about here. These are the newest internet adoption statistics globally. And they're very consistent with the ITU numbers as well, so there are no big surprises, saying basically about half of the world now is connected to the internet. But there's some very interesting regional differences, and I want to explore why you think these regional differences exist. Now, not surprisingly, the United States, and I should say the numbers are really, this is the first time I've seen numbers that talk about those who lack internet connectivity, which I think is an inflection point as our conversation. Before it was always how many people adopt, what percentage of the population. Now it's a question what the percentage of the population has not adopted. That's a remarkable shift, I think. So not surprisingly, in North America, only 11% of the population is not connected to the internet. That's a remarkable number. But other regions are interesting. Of course, you have places like Africa, there's still over 70% have not adopted. They're the laggards. In Europe, it's about 26% has not adopted. But in Latin America and in the Caribbean, it's about 38, 39% has not adopted. Now that's both a good news, that means that far and away the populations have adopted, but it shows there's a significant number of people have not adopted. What is your sense for the reason for that number? Is it, and I realize these are not mutually exclusive, is it availability? Is it affordability? Is it content? What are the drivers, and why do you see a difference between, for example, North America and Europe and Latin America and the Caribbean? Raul?
Yeah, I looked at that quite a bit. The issue is not availability, because if you look at the coverage statistics, meaning where networks are, roughly in Latin America, you get a coverage of 95%. So what we call this the demand gap as opposed to the supply gap, the difference between the people that could buy it and they don't. And your numbers are consistent with mine. You say 38, I say 62 that have it, so we are in the zone. So why? There are three reasons why people don't buy it. One, they can't afford it. Interestingly enough, prices in Latin America for mobile broadband have been dropping like a ton of lead. So the issue is distribution of income. There's people that don't have enough money. It's affordability. The second one is digital literacy. Is that I don't know how to manipulate the technology in order to conduct a Google search. And the third is cultural and linguistic relevance. Why should I go into the internet if I don't know what the internet can give to me? And so we need to tackle those three issues. Clearly, for affordability, the taxation numbers that I mentioned were on producers. On top of that, you have the taxation on consumers, value-added taxes and special taxes. And our analysis show that 21% of the monies paid by consumers in broadband go to consumer taxation. So that's clearly a way to shift the lever quite a bit there. You'll need some subsidies in some people that don't have it, and some countries are moving in that direction. Not necessarily in Latin America. China, Australia are doing quite a bit in that area. Then the second one, digital literacy, you have to do more effort. That's a government responsibility, training. I think Jorge's pointed to that effect. You need to train people on how to do this, and there's not enough done in the region for the digital literacy. And the third is local content. I think that's a huge issue. Think about Wikipedia, which is the 5th largest site accessed in Latin America. Only 4% of articles in Wikipedia are written in Spanish. The rest is in English. So either you speak English or you're out of what it is essentially a public good. So we need to do a lot more. Our analysis show that roughly 80% of the most popular sites as access in Latin America are produced and developed outside Latin America. So it jives very nicely with the need to foster entrepreneurship and development of local content and local services.
Okay, is that consistent with your experience?
It is consistent, and again, I mean, looking forward, I think it's an issue of education. No? It's an issue of competition. It is an issue of relevance as well. No? And I again think that the way to deal with these issues is by making sure that they are part of every single type of development intervention that a country does. No? And look, people will become comfortable and will use technology if it's thought at an early stage. And if it's thought properly, no, if it's not just an issue of handing over the instrument and the software, but also showing how it is used. And I believe that those are some of the elements that we need to put together in the region. And there are important efforts in this regard, but there is still a long way to go.
Let me push back a little bit, if I could, on the digital literacy. Is this I look around the world generally, and it seems a lot of the digital literacy is not so much trained as it is age issues. Younger people seem to have, who grow up with it. Latin America skews young as compared to Europe, for example, so you would expect an increasing amount of digital literacy in Latin America, just as a matter of demographics and the like. I'm surprised on the WikiLeaks and on why do we see I'm sorry, on Wikipedia. You can see I really think about.
I knew what
Yeah,
you
that's right.
meant.
One of those wikis on Wikipedia as compared to WikiLeaks. On why do you think only 4%? And why is there this lag in the creation of Spanish language content? Wikipedia is has its content generated by users,
Yeah.
so you would expect there to be at least a proportional amount. Why is there this lag?
I think that even if though there's a lot of entrepreneurship in Latin America, there's a lot of what I call tropicalization of applications developed overseas, targeting the 60% that already uses it. So what we need to do is focus on the remaining 38%. In Colombia, the minister had a very interesting point for e-government applications. They say, let's focus on developing applications that would enable a worker not to lose a day of work because they have to go to a government office to conduct some sort of administration. So we really need to think how the 62% are well covered. They know the stuff, and for better or for worse, they speak English very well. Thank you very much. The problem is the other 38%, and we need to, and that's a government responsibility. I'll tell you. I mean, Africa has a very interesting point on Wikipedia. I think it was Cote d'Ivoire. They went to Wikipedia and said, listen, we want to develop a development center in Cote d'Ivoire developing articles for Wikipedian local languages. And the Wikipedia guys were, you can imagine, they were very happy. So they stimulated that. Why can't we do that in Latin America? We could as well.
Eric, how do you see this playing out? Are you seeing differences across the Americas, or talk a little bit about the difference in some of the countries that you noted before?
One of the things we're seeing a lot of use of, and you mentioned the demographics of Latin America skewing young, we're seeing a lot of the digital footprint in the context of social media and in the context of social movements. And this is a trend that I think has become very active, particularly in some countries that have scored very low on the digital life scenario, in particular Venezuela, but also others. And there's a direct linkage there in terms of the politics and in terms of press freedom generally that goes beyond digital life. But this is how people are increasingly communicating. And for example, Venezuelans are very plugged in. And yet Venezuela as a country scores low on the index for various reasons in terms of some of the government policies and various things like that. So, in some ways, this is also, this is a snapshot. But there are also some other interesting trends that are going on. And this is just me speaking. I'm not speaking from any deep analysis here, but my anticipation would be that as people become even more comfortable with this, you're going to see the internet and social media in particular become a real driver of demands for social change, not just in Venezuela, but we've also seen it, frankly, around the region. You're seeing it in Mexico, you're seeing it in Brazil, you're seeing it in Chile. So this is a really interesting new tool that I think really can't be overestimated.
Oh,
I mean, building on that, we've done work trying to find the linkages between two factors, political participation and transparency and digitization, and those two factors are totally aligned. So, I mean, the research indicates that the more you have, we still are dealing with a reverse causation, what's driving what, but clearly there is an enabler for moving towards more rule of law, more political participation and activity, as you're pointing out. So the numbers support that as well.
And then there's the issue of relevance. Look, in Uruguay, we supported a government effort to implement two things in the agriculture sector. One is traceability. So putting a chip on each head of cattle to know exactly where the animals are and their life and how they progress. And the other is geomapping for agricultural fields, and it is a system that has all the information relevant for those that participate in the agriculture sector. So when you have those applications and you have that information available, people use them because they are relevant to what they do, and that is how you develop also literacy and you develop the demand. And I think that we need to think about more interventions like these ones. I can also think about the financial sector, and how do you reach the poorest? Look, when when I started working, payrolls were paid in cash in Mexico. No, so when someone had to give money to someone else in the family, they would have to move from one part of the city to the other. No, with today's technology, you have mobile banking, and you can send money from one part of the city to the other, and that saves an enormous amount of money, which is a huge tax on the poorest as a percentage of income. So if we create the relevant applications and we make them available, I am sure that demand, literacy and demand will follow.
It also helps on the security side, because if you're transporting all this cash, that's temptation for criminal behavior, no?
Yes, of course.
All right. So this issue of relevancy and the like is, I think, fascinating. One of the problems from a policymaking perspective is you're always fighting the last war because that's the information that you have. But yet, at the risk of stating the obvious, the internet is not only just changing, but changing at an incredibly rapid rate. So we start with the surprising aspects of wireless technology, and surprising in the sense that nobody predicted the extraordinary adoption rate. But it was easy in retrospect because everyone likes to communicate, and you don't need to be literate in order to use a cell phone to make a call and to speak to somebody else. We then went to a period of time on the internet where content, particularly in English, and not as many other languages, were static. You had websites being very important. Now the dramatic increase is on social media, which is again a little bit more like communicating verbally, together with video, which also has a different aspect. Do you all see this shift in the value proposition of using broadband, social media, video, and the like, having a material impact on the issue of adoptability and use throughout the Latin America community? Raul?
There is a shift, but the shift is very similar to what we see in OECD countries, particularly with regards to video. Video traffic is growing by leaps and bounds, and that's one of the factors that is straining the infrastructure. Traffic is growing at like, 30% a year, just because of the usage of video. I don't see it so much on social media because we are there. I mean, Latin America, if you look at the members of Facebook, Facebook is a dominant social network, versus the users of internet, it's roughly 80%. So Facebook is sort of like the drug of entry
right.
to the use of internet. You start with Facebook and then you move around. So I don't see it on social, we are there. But I think video is really the driver. But you're right, I mean, in terms of the speed of changes, I think that if you look forward, I would focus less on what we call the digitization of consumption, which is what we're talking about, and digitization of production, which is what Jorge was referring to. Because I think that is a big challenge. How enterprises are incorporating digital technologies to increase their productivity. And there we have a big, big gap.
All right, do you see that governments understand the point that Raul was just making about the importance of the investment in the technology for future economic growth? I mean, it's one thing to say it, but it's another thing to really institutionalize it and use it in decision making, particularly as we move to Internet of Things and 5G, where the technology and the infrastructure is going to be apparently so embedded into the economic production of a country. Do you see that people really understanding this, or are people still just trying to understand it?
Well, I think that on that particular point, the heterogeneity of the region also applies. No? So there are countries where this is a very important part of our conversation, and it's not necessarily a financing issue. I mean, we do not necessarily invest or finance directly the ICT sector, but it's really part of the conversation. I mean, again, I just came back from Mexico City. One of the engagements we have with Mexico City is a reimbursable advisory service on ICT and fiber optics. Help them make the best possible use of a network that is already there, buried under Mexico City's ground, and it's not currently in use. No? So they are paying us, not receiving finance from us to work in that area. No, I mentioned the interaction with the Minister of Agriculture. So as you can see, ICT and investments in ICT and connectivity and digital technology are very much part of the conversation. But that is not the case in other countries in the region. No?
And let me also add to that. I mean, and within countries, you also see divergences, right? Some communities, some states, particularly in federal systems, some are doing better. For example, Medellin in Colombia is doing some very interesting things, right? Bogota is doing some interesting things. But if you look at some other areas of Colombia, maybe not so far advanced. So, I mean, we have to drill down even further into some of those issues. The other issue I want to just simply raise, but I don't have any answers for, just because I think every conversation like this has to at least touch on the issue, is cybersecurity. And as this technology becomes even more prevalent across the region, you are going to see some bad people try to do some bad things with it, and that's already happening. Your question, David, was, do the governments, are they focusing on what needs to be done to develop the sector fully? You've heard outstanding expertise there. I would simply say that from the security side, there's a long way to go. And this also has to be embedded in the conversation because, and as the index was making very, very clear, public confidence in these technologies is critical for their uptake. And if there's no confidence, they're just not going to use it. So I think this is two sides of the same coin.
And just to sort of focus a little bit more attention on this extraordinarily important point, if we are focusing on those who have not yet adopted for whatever reason, it seems to me if they're constantly hearing from the government of all the problems, and they're already obviously haven't identified the advantages of using it, doesn't that make that adoption for that last group that much more difficult? And how do institutions deal with that challenge?
But there is another issue that I also want to bring to the conversation, which is legal systems and the validity of transactions through electronic means. And I do think that the region also has a challenge there, and this is an issue that has to be addressed, no? Both from the perspective of regulation and legislation, and from the perspective of enforcement.
Raul?
I'll build on that. I think that I see it less as an issue of regulation and more as an issue of creating the conditions for the sector to develop, the digital economy to develop. And I think, for instance, capital markets, totally underdeveloped. If you don't have capital markets, you don't have VC investment because there are no exit strategies. You cannot float a stock unless you come to the NASDAQ. So we have an issue. Cybersecurity is another one. So one of the focus is really the conditions to make this to develop, and maybe stay away from and I wouldn't say completely, but let a little bit of the invisible hand work its way through the process. Clearly, the state has to intervene for that 38% because there are some economic factors that prevent the private sector to go into. But beyond that, I think that we should let it, except for the taxation issue. And then the other one that I think it was related to your comparison, why Peru is not there. I think that, and that is very revealing. I think that in Latin America, what we have is an institutional failure to grasp this issue of the digital economy. And institutional in the sense that in many countries, you don't have the institutional architecture to say, well, these are the policies that we're going to drive forward. This is what the vision that we have of a country. And conversely, you don't have the executive branch actually sitting in front of the country and saying, this is the objective. And why not Peru? Because in Peru, when they talk about economic development, they talk about oil, they talk about fisheries, they talk about copper, but they forget that close to 15% of the GDP from a direct and indirect standpoint is being generated by this stuff. So there's a lack of awareness and a lack of leadership. So I'd say those are the two really high tent poles.
Let me turn to the audience. We have a minute or two left for a couple of quick questions if we have some. Please, and identify yourself, of course.
Good morning. My name is Rodrigo Contreras. I'm the Trade Commissioner of Chile here in the U.S. Well, 3 of the 4 countries in Pacific Alliance are scoring very well in the index. And the Pacific Alliance just established a working group on digital agenda. So they are thinking, the 4 countries are thinking in issues, areas, or initiatives in which the 4 countries, as a trade bloc, that's important because collectively they could do things that probably unilaterally would be more difficult. Which are the areas or initiatives in which you think the Pacific Alliance can move forward as a trade bloc in this digital agenda? Thank you.
Eric, you want to start off?
Well, let me just make a very quick point on that. First of all, I think the Pacific Alliance is doing some very interesting things, not least of which in this sector. You know, but it also has a responsibility, because in some ways this is cutting edge. The Pacific Alliance as a concept is cutting edge, and the last thing you would want to do is to create a regional expectation that is not absolutely at the forefront. And I know you know that, Rodrigo, but I'm simply saying, you know, we have seen other examples across Latin America where you have groups of countries come together and they actually restrict markets instead of create conditions to grow them. And I know that from the private sector perspective of US companies and others which are looking at Latin America, they see the Pacific Alliance as a huge opportunity, but they also have to see how things develop there. So in the terms of what specifically they should focus on, I'll leave that to our other two panelists, but I would simply come alongside your comments and say, congratulations, but also please make sure that as you're developing these region-wide standards, that they're done so in a way that would actually create trade and build for the future.
Okay.
Well, I think that there are benefits of scale to benefit from, no? So each of the countries could have individual efforts in several areas. Here, you know, the workload can be split among the 4 countries, and more value can be created. And by the way, we would be very happy to support the Pacific Alliance on this and any other matters.
Oh,
I think that there are 3 areas. One is definitely taxation, and follow the example of the single digital market in Europe. The rules of taxation, particularly of the digital side of the value chain, it's completely heterogeneous, and we need to bring some consistency there. And the example of the Europeans in that regard is important to be followed. There's the opacity on tax rules and how much the digital players are paying, if they are, is complete in the region. And it's very difficult to understand. So that's one. The other one is social mobility of human capital. The fact that you want people to transfer very easily and create a fluidity and porosity. So if you graduate in a university here, you can go and work in another side, in another country, and the title is recognized. And the third, I think, building on the scale effect, I think that we have a little bit of a competition among countries. So you might have 2 countries working on similar kind of services and applications. The total public sector in Latin America is investing roughly $20 billion in digital applications and R&D, no? So, and the redundancies, the duplication of resources, the inefficiencies in the assignment. I don't think that that's little money. I don't think we need to increase the public funding. We just need to invest it properly. So the 3 countries get together and say, okay, well, let's add up. This is the monies that are going into startups and into scholarships and everything. Can we optimize this in an integrated manner? That will go, a long way.
well, we're past our allotted time. What I think we've learned this morning in a relatively brief but important and very informative time is that we're at an inflection point, both globally but particularly in the Americas, where the issue of digital life is no longer just of academic interest, not just of a developed world and urban area interest, but rather goes to the very heart of society, culture, and the like. Thank you to Telefonica for its great work in putting this together in a very brief but very, very clear set of priorities. Thank you very much to the Council of the Americas for hosting us. Thank you to this great panel, and I think we should owe them a great applause and thanks for their participation and their insights.